Hello and welcome back. I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Let's first take a look at some of our headlines. US President Donald Trump says Hamas didn't want a deal as the US and Israel walk away from peace talks amid uncertainty over diplomacy. Israel has said it will allow continues of aid drops from the air as the UK says a third of Gazans are starving, with 122 hunger deaths reported. Meanwhile, UN Chief Antonio Guterres has urged for immediate action in Gaza to stop reported starvation, stating that words don't feed starving children. This comes as President Trump slams Emmanuel Macron's planned announcement recognising a Palestinian state. The US has warned China to stop fueling Russia's aggression in Ukraine at the United Nations ahead of potential US sanctions on buyers of Russian energy. China has hit back, accusing Washington of trying to shift the blame and spark controversy. This comes as Donald Trump arrives in Scotland for a 4-day visit as he confirms that trade discussions with the EU are ongoing, saying that a deal has a 50% chance. EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen will meet the President on Sunday ahead of the August 1st deadline. Cambodia has called for an immediate ceasefire as military action along the disputed border with Thailand heads into a third day. This comes after dozens of casualties were reported from both sides, with more than 100,000 people displaced from the border region. A bus travelling from Lima to Peru's Amazon region has overturned in the Andes Mountains, leaving at least 18 people dead. The double-decker bus overturned on a highway with dozens of further passengers injured, according to local authorities. Voters in Taiwan are casting their ballots on whether to recall 1/5 of the island's parliament, all from the major opposition party. Supporters of the move say the opposition is too close to China amid heightened tensions over Taiwan's independence. And Ghislaine Maxwell, an associate of the late financier Jeffrey Epstein, is seeking a Supreme Court hearing in a bid to overturn her conviction. This comes amid allegations about Epstein's relationship with President Trump, which he has denied as fake news. But we start this hour at the United Nations Security Council meeting on Friday, where tensions have flared between the United States and China. While Washington accused Beijing of aiding Russia's war in Ukraine through the export of dual-use goods, China refuted the claims and warned against confrontation. Acting US Ambassador to the UN, Dorothy Shea, urged countries specifically naming China to halt exports that contribute to Russia's military capabilities, including components found in drones and missiles used against Ukraine. She emphasised that the continued flow of such goods to Russia helps its missiles and drone attacks and undermines global efforts to curb the conflict. Here is what she said at this meeting.
If China is sincere in calling for peace, it should stop fueling Russia's aggression. Beijing's claim to have implemented strong export controls on dual-use goods falls apart in the face of daily recovery of Chinese-produced components in the drones, weapons, and vehicles that Russia uses against Ukraine.
Well, China in turn has pushed back strongly against these accusations. China's deputy UN ambassador, Geng Shuang, defended China's stance. He emphasised that China maintains strict controls and has not contributed weapons to the conflict. He also criticised the US for deflecting responsibility. Let's now listen into those comments.
正如我们此前多次在安理会指出的那样，中国不是乌克兰危机的制造者，也不是当事方。中国从未向冲突任何一方提供过致命武器，始终严格管控军民两用物项，包括无人机的出口。我们敦促美方停止在乌克兰问题上甩锅推责、制造对立，多为停火止战、劝和促谈做出一些切实的努力。
Well, this comes as a report by Reuters suggests that Chinese-made engines are being covertly shipped via front companies to a state-owned drone manufacturer in Russia labelled as industrial refrigeration units. This to avoid detection in the wake of Western sanctions. Well, a lot to unpack here. Joining us to do so is Mark Sutherland, a geopolitical commentator, joining us from London. Mark, as always, a pleasure to have you on the programme. Let's first look at these US comments. Of course, we know that there are potential sanctions coming, not just on Russia, but also tariffs that would be implemented on third-party countries buying Russian energy. Does this risk widening the scope of this European conflict and potentially bringing in countries outside of Europe and North America?
Joshua, good to be with you. I mean, you and I have read the same reports in regard to the dual way that you could use certain components. So if you're shipping components, as they say, that they're for refrigerators and that they end up in drones, then no wonder that Ukraine and the Americans are concerned about that, because they just think, well, China, you're saying one thing and then you're acting in another. You are right. There is always a concern that this could widen, but the other context is that China is seeking for the bipolar world to then take over in regard to the economic strength of America. That is what it's constantly working to do. You and I, like everyone else in the world, the last thing we want is to see things expand. So people need to be honest on both sides. If they're finding resources that are being used for drones when they're supposed to be for fridges and vice versa, America suddenly, is going to put more potential armaments in the Ukrainian hands, either bought by NATO, etc. Then on both sides, people need to get together and de-escalate this. As we discussed the other day, when Ukraine and Russia met in Turkey, 45 minutes discussion about prisoner exchange. That discussion needs to go for far longer, because that also will stop any concerns about about escalating this on a wider scale.
Yes, Mark, China responds saying that the US is shifting blame and sparking controversy. Is there any validity in their point? Of course, Trump came in saying that this war would be done within the first day or two of his second term once assuming office. That, of course, hasn't happened. Do you think this is the US trying to point the finger at other parties rather than looking potentially at the Trump administration's failure to get a deal done with Putin?
But the US is also concerned, as I was just saying, about the economic strength of China and them trying to take their position. You and I both know that within the sort of news feed, there are comments, there is brinkmanship, and we want to see both sides, on all sides of this conflict, and including in this economic war, then to actually sit down and de-escalate. We want to see more talking instead of the appalling fighting that's going on, Josh.
Absolutely. Mark Sutherland, you will be staying with us as we shift our attention away from this ongoing conflict and we head over to North America, where Ghislaine Maxwell, convicted of aiding Jeffrey Epstein in the sexual abuse of teenage girls, is seeking relief from the US Supreme Court. Maxwell, currently serving a 20-year prison sentence, is appealing her conviction, arguing that a 2007 non-prosecution agreement Epstein reached with the government should have shielded her from prosecution. Her legal team argues that Epstein's plea deal should have also protected his associates. Let's listen in.
She has been treated unfairly for the past 5 years. She didn't get a fair trial. We're still appealing to the Supreme Court. We're going to be filing a reply in the Supreme Court on her cert petition on Monday. Remember, people have questioned her honesty, which I think is just wrong. Remember, a juror lied to get onto the jury, admitted to lying to get onto her jury. She did not get a fair trial. No prosecutor even mentioned her until Epstein died. So we feel that the process for Ghislaine has been unfair. She was denied bail. She was treated worse than an animal would be treated in jail when she was first held, woken up every 15 minutes. So we're just trying to get through the process where we are now and get her some relief. So that's where we are today.
Well, meanwhile, the case continues to cast a shadow over President Donald Trump. The US president has denied any wrongdoing despite past associations with Epstein, denying claims of his name appearing on those files. Let's listen to some comments.
No, I was never Brett. No. You're making a very big thing over something that's not a big thing. You should be talking about, if you're going to talk about that, talk about Clinton, talk about the former president of Harvard, talk about all of his friends, talk about the hedge fund guys that were with him all the time. Don't talk about Trump. What you should be talking about is the fact that we have the greatest 6 months in the history of a presidency, according to a lot of people.
Well, Mark, thank you for staying with us. Some comments there from Trump that we will need to unpack. But let's first look at Ghislaine Maxwell and her situation. Of course, some quite bold statements made by her legal representatives there. Do you think there's any validity in her sort of clamour for a further look into this and Supreme Court action over her convictions?
I think the number one thing about all of this is that every single thing in regard to the whole Maxwell case needs to be on the table. Every single thing. Now, he was then given that particular legal distribution that happened, I think, 2007 in Florida, which was a shock to many. It's not going to be surprising in one way, you could say, that her legal team will then take the next step, because all the comments, all the chatter when Pam Bondi says there's nothing to see here, etc. That then gives them the opportunity to come back and raise all their legal concerns that they have. But she has had a long relationship with Epstein. Many people in America and around the world feel that they still do not have the answers that they have. And the MAGA movement promised that when he came into office that he would put all those papers on the table, and people are still asking for that. They're still clamoring for that, and within their legal system, then they think, right, okay, we'll go for an appeal on this issue to then say that this sentence, maybe try and get her off, or this sentence is far too long.
Yes, Mark, let's now look at the implications for President Donald Trump. You alluded there to the questions being raised, not just by his opposition, but his core MAGA supporters. Again, Trump questioned. Again, Trump deflecting, pointing the finger to Bill Clinton, among other names. Is this going to go away for Trump until potentially those files are released? Or if Trump's name is on there, as some reports from the Wall Street Journal have suggested, Pam Bondi informing the president, do you think this will continue to be pushed under the rug for the foreseeable future?
My advice would be just put everything on the table. Whatever people have got, put it on the table. And yes, Bill Clinton needs to be questioned. What was that blue dress about? There is far more here to actually talk about. It's deeply concerning which three-letter agencies are involved and beyond. I think in any situation, you then turn around and say, right, here are the files, get everything out. But of course, people would turn around and say, the previous 4 years, were those files doctored by the previous administration, Joshua? There is so much up in the air, and then it creates whatever you release, people won't believe you at all. This is the difficult situation that the administration is in, and people were very they had a lot of high expectations when Kash Patel became head of the FBI, along with Dan Bongino as his number two, and people still have those expectations. They want the truth out. They want everything on the table.
Mark Sutherland, thank you ever so much for joining us on both of those topics. We will, of course, continue to bring you updates on the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war and also controversy relating to those Epstein files. But let's now look towards the Middle East. And UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has urged immediate action in Gaza, describing the situation as a moral crisis beyond humanitarian concerns. Speaking at Amnesty International's Global Assembly, he said over 1,000 Palestinians have died since late May trying to access food. Gaza's health ministry has reported that 122 starvation deaths, including 83 children with widespread child malnutrition, confirmed by the United Nations. Let's listen in now to Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
Our own heroic staff continue to serve in unimaginable conditions. Many are so numb and depleted that they say they feel neither dead nor alive. Children speaking of wanting to go to heaven because at least they say there is food there. We hold video calls with our own humanitarians who are starving before our eyes. And this is not just a humanitarian crisis, it's a moral crisis that challenges the global conscience. We will continue to speak out at every opportunity, but words don't feed hungry children.
Well, the UN's World Food Programme warns that 90,000 women and children urgently need treatment for malnutrition. Starvation deaths in Gaza have risen, with 9 more reported on Friday, according to local officials. France and the UK have urged Israel to lift aid restrictions. In contrast, US President Donald Trump has called for Israel to escalate its military actions, saying they need to finish the job against Hamas. Trump's comments made during a private visit to Scotland signalled a shift away from negotiation towards further military confrontation. Trump also said that Hamas wants to die and Israel must take stronger action. Let's now listen to the President of the United States.
Hamas didn't really want to make a deal. I think they want to die, and it's very, very bad. And it got to be to a point where you're going to have to finish the job. They really, they asked for things. Don't forget, we got a lot of hostages out. So now we're down to the final hostages, and they know what happens after you get the final hostages. And basically, because of that, they really didn't want to make a deal.
Guterres, however, has called for a permanent ceasefire, the release of hostages and unrestricted humanitarian access to alleviate Gaza's suffering. Well, with us to discuss these updates, Yossi Kapawasa, an Israeli intelligence and security expert who's joining us from Tel Aviv. Yossi, as always, a pleasure to have you on the programme. Further condemnation from global players about the current situation in Gaza. This, of course, coming after overnight we had updates from Israel saying that aid would be allowed from international players through airdrops, as opposed to, of course, the more traditional route through. We know that there are tons of aid waiting at the borders. Do you think this move by Israel is to appease international players, knowing that the actual amount of aid that gets in won't be too substantial given the restrictions on planes and the amount they can carry?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And to the point, I would say that we all know that there is enough humanitarian aid provided to Gaza. It's not a matter of lack of supplies. The problem is with the distribution, and the distribution is not happening properly because of the UN agencies and because of Hamas. They do not distribute the aid. And then they complain that there is starvation and hunger. It's ridiculous. And when the supplies get in, Hamas takes them over and make sure that they would sell them in higher prices. That's what we are witnessing in Gaza.
Yossi, sorry to interject. I do understand what you're saying, but also the GHF have been distributing aid with confirmation and Israel allowing it. That has seen a reported over 1,000 deaths around these aid distribution sites and reports of the humanitarian situation surrounding hunger worsening. So it seems that the model that Israel's allowing isn't sufficient, and aid now being dropped by air, which surely will allow Hamas to at least gain some of that aid with no one monitoring where it's going and who's picking it up. The situation seems to contradict itself slightly.
No, the GHF, which is distributing aid under our supervision, is trying to give the aid to the Palestinians. What we see there is difficulties in controlling the big amounts of Palestinians coming to the areas where the aid is distributed. And in some cases, they were just running towards the soldiers that are overlooking the place. And they felt under threat, and something that caused them to shoot in the towards the air. And later on, they had to shoot in the legs of the people that were just coming close to them. in a threatening mode. That was the case. What we are trying to do as GHF is to supply aid to the population. We brought millions of aid packages in order to supply it to the population. That's what's happening there. We don't bring them in order to get aid, in order to kill them. That makes no sense. That's ridiculous. What we are witnessing here is an orchestrated campaign by Hamas with the support of the UN agencies that are afraid that GHF is going to replace them as the distributor of aid. And they are embarked on this starvation campaign that can be solved very easily, by the way, if we reach a ceasefire. Hamas, as President Trump said, doesn't want a ceasefire, doesn't want a solution. And that's the case. We were more than ready. We made all kinds of unbelievable concessions in order to convince Hamas to accept a ceasefire that would have put up a solution to all these problems. Hamas refused to accept any of the ideas of the ceasefire, raising all kinds of demands that they knew that are unacceptable, in order to make sure that there's not going to be a ceasefire.
Yes,
that's
absolutely.
where we're standing.
Yes, Yossi, of course, the situation around a ceasefire is extremely difficult. I just want to allude to the fact that it's the United States and Israel saying that there is enough aid, and there are many countries, many international Western countries saying that there isn't, along with over 100 NGOs and aid groups. That's what's on the table. That is what we are hearing. We can only go off that information. Of course, reporting in Gaza itself is limited because of restrictions on international journalists. So the situation is unclear, but the understanding, of course, is that Hamas getting hold of aid is detrimental not just to Israel's effort, but also a continuation of a war that is seeing a potential humanitarian crisis. Yossi, I quickly want to allude to that ceasefire before we do move on. Of course, talks now breaking down, US and Israeli delegations both leaving these discussions. Have we ever been further away from peace?
Well, we are in a low position in the efforts to reach a ceasefire because Hamas refused to the suggestions made by the mediators, including the United States, Qatar, and Egypt. And even Qatar is upset with Hamas now. So it's difficult to see how we can move forward, but we didn't lose hope. And we make an effort to resume the talks maybe this coming week. Now that Hamas realizes that if they do not accept the conditions, then there's an Israeli effort waiting for them that would remove them from power. That's what we are forced to do because they refuse to reach a ceasefire. We shall have to take a military action and remove them from power with force.
Yes, absolutely. Yossi, stay with us. We're going to stay on the topic as France plans to recognise a Palestinian state this September at the United Nations General Assembly. President Emmanuel Macron announced on Thursday. He said this move aims to promote peace in the Middle East and hopes other countries will follow France's lead. France would be the first major Western nation to officially recognise Palestine, a decision that has sparked strong backlash from Israel and the United States. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu condemned the plan, calling it a reward for terror and warning it could enable further attacks on Israel. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz also denounced the move as a surrender to terrorism. On Friday, President Trump dismissed Macron's announcement, saying it doesn't matter and will not change anything, despite praising Macron personally. Let's now listen to those comments from Trump.
Well, that's what he does. I mean, that's fine. If he does that, that's up to him. It's not up to me. I'm with the United States. I'm not with France.
Yossi, thank you for staying with us. We don't have too long left, but condemnation from Israel and the United States as expected. France saying that this isn't pro-Hamas, this isn't rewarding terror. It's doing the opposite because it's looking to a two-state solution that probably wouldn't involve Hamas. Why is this so significant, and why has it drawn so much criticism from the US, but also from Israel?
Well, I think it is significant because it hampers the efforts to reach any sort of solution between us and the Palestinians. This decision of how the solution should look like and force it on the parties makes no sense, and just to jeopardize the efforts in the future to move towards peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And we have to work these issues in direct negotiations between us and the Palestinians. This is where this decision should be taken. And of course, coming with this decision at this point of time, after the Hamas massacre of October 7th, makes no sense. It looks as if you reward the terrorists. And what are you trying to accomplish? It's maybe some internal considerations that has to do with internal French politics. I don't know, but for the Palestinians and for the Israelis, this is a move backwards on any attempt to reach some solution in the future, and it's rewarding terrorism, and it's a bad move. And, on the ground, by the way, as President Trump said, and he's totally right, on the ground this is going to have no impact. The situation on the ground is not decided by some declarations in Paris. It's
Yes.
the situation on the ground is going to say the same, and the problems that we have in Gaza and the problems that we have in the Judea and Samaria areas, the problems that we have with the fact that the Palestinian Authority, the one that Macron spoke with.
Yossi, unfortunately,
leaders,
we are out of
financing
time.
terrorism.
Sorry, Yossi, to cut you off there. We are out of time, but thank you ever so much for your insight and your opinions on this topic, which is, of course, divisive. We will continue to bring you the updates on the ground in Gaza, but also as diplomacy continues yet stalls. But moving on now to the Indo-Pacific, Cambodia has announced first casualty figures from border clashes with Thailand. The clashes marks the most intense conflict between the two countries in years. It has involved artillery, tanks and airstrikes, leaving both sides with significant casualties. The violence stemmed from a long-standing border dispute, with both countries blaming each other for sparking the conflict. The UN Security Council has urged maximum restraint and a peaceful resolution, while Cambodia has called for an immediate ceasefire. Thailand has expressed its openness to diplomatic negotiations, with Malaysia offering to mediate talks. Well, with us to discuss this ongoing conflict, this difficult situation, of course, that could reach an all-out war, which we've heard from Thailand in recent days. Rohan Gunaratne, an international affairs expert, joining us live from Singapore. A potential shift, Rohan, that we have seen from calls of bilateral talks in a situation that won't involve third-party discussion and mediation, now a positive shift, but a conflict that has now entered a third day. How quickly does this need to be wrapped up for not just stability between Thailand and Cambodia, but the wider region?
Joshua, you used the critical phrase, that is, governments will have to move very fast to resolve this dispute. Otherwise, it will lead to, again, a geopolitical and a superpower conflict, because Thailand is supported by the United States, and of course, Cambodia is supported by Russia. Of course, the Thai military is 4 times larger than the Cambodian military. So we hope that Malaysia's offer and the offer of other countries will be taken seriously, and Cambodia and Thailand will move to a phase of dialogue, discussion, and diplomacy. Otherwise, this conflict will protract and it will become a conflict that is supported by 2 powers.
Yes, and Professor Gunaratne, let's look at the situation of both countries. We have around a minute or so left. Of course, both economies not at the strongest point. How devastating could an all-out war be for both nations in the face of those financial difficulties?
Already, more than 200,000 people have been displaced. A smaller number has been killed compared to other conflict zones. But what is important is that this is beginning to affect the economy of the nations. This morning, I had a phone call from a friend who was planning to visit Thailand and asked me, is Thailand safe? So I believe that it will impact on tourism, it will impact on trade, and it will impact on investments. That is why it is so important that the ASEAN and governments in the region and outside and the UN, they all move at lightning speed to resolve this conflict.
Rohan Gunaratne, thank you as always for joining us on the programme. That is all that we have time for, but we will be back very soon with more of the latest updates from across the world. Thank you.